Well, once again, good morning and welcome to Easter at Gateway. We're thankful that you've chosen to worship with us today. And what great truth we've already heard sung in this song, that the work of Jesus Christ on the cross and what he accomplished for us in the empty grave means that we are standing on sacred ground, holy ground when we come to worship him on Easter morning. And today, more than any other time of the year, we celebrate enthusiastically resurrection, new life. I have to admit this morning, I'm sad not to see you in person. It's my favorite day of the year as a pastor and as a follower of Jesus Christ. I love seeing the excitement on people's faces as they walk to church on Easter Sunday. Perhaps you're getting ready for your little kids to be wearing their new dresses or new Sunday attire. Baby blues and pinks and the lilies that usually are right here on the steps. It's an opportunity for us with outward expressions of joy and newness and life and spring to declare Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And while this is appropriate and good, and I'm telling you, Gateway family, I can't wait till Easter 2021 when we celebrate together in person. It's also a reminder this morning that if we're being truthful, and I believe the church should be the most honest place in town, we must admit that death is much more prevalent and common than resurrection is in our experiences. Death is always in the news. And given the circumstances in our island and in our city and nation and world in the last few weeks and month, death is what you see come up on your news feed all the time, isn't it? It's hard to not follow the daily tracking of how many people have been affected, how many lives have been lost. Even just these last few weeks as I've talked to and prayed with many of you over the phone, you've shared with me how in your own families and in your own personal lives, those that you know that have been affected and some that you know very dearly who have died. Death is not just in the newspapers. It's too prevalent right now in our personal news feeds and news reels as well. That great enemy, death, creeps in. People we love are gone. Health, perhaps, that we once relished is fleeting. And relationships that you poured yourself into for time and time again, perhaps right now, is on life support. As much as we push death to the side, we know this morning that it is coming. And the scriptures tell us that death is an even deeper rooted problem within us. That death is not just something we see in the world, that death is not just something we experience physically, but that all of us are dead, the scriptures tell us, in our trespasses and in our sins. We are the walking dead apart from Christ. We need forgiveness. We need new life. And on Easter morning 2020, Gateway Church, we need the hope that resurrection brings. And that's why we're gathering this morning. That's why you've woken up early this Easter morning. That's why you're gathered around your TVs and your iPhones and your computer screens together this morning. We believe that something happened on Easter morning. Something happened on Easter morning that changes everything, that flips the narrative, that the inevitability of death and its victory is that the shock of Easter morning says something new can happen. Death is not your final destination. Now listen, this is not just positive thinking this morning. This is not just trying to lift you up by your own bootstraps and make you feel good in a tough time. No, this is true because it happened in time and in space. that Jesus is more than just some moral exemplar for you and for me, that Jesus raises our expectations on Easter morning 2020, because thousands of years ago, Christ literally rose from the dead, that he conquered that enemy of sin and the grave. And in a real, tangible way this morning, we too can love and experience resurrection afresh. What happened then matters now, because what happened then matters for eternity. What Jesus did for us thousands of years ago in rising from the dead offers hope, forgiveness, purpose for you and I in the midst of our trying and chaotic times. And to know the message of Easter morning in the face of death and despair and sadness all around us means that we are as well looking forward to and anticipating a day to come when resurrection and newness will be experienced on all people that know and worship and follow this resurrected Lord. The scriptures say that the last one which will be destroyed is death. It's an enemy. Death on Easter morning is handed a fatal blow. Now, we know how the story unfolds on Easter. In fact, you've probably already talked about it this morning with your kids around the table. You've already, no doubt, reminded yourself of what Jesus did that morning. But I want us together to suspend what we already know in our mind for a second, to press the brakes, if you will, and to slow down and experience afresh what God did through Jesus Christ that Easter morning. I want us this morning as God's people to go back to that first Easter. The end of the story means so much more when we track the scene at the tomb from the beginning. And the news that Easter morning was very much like ours is. It was saturated in death. In fact, the anticipated stench of it was in the air. And the women who first went to that tomb were expecting to see and to smell it. And on their way, they found that resurrection was there meeting them. I want to invite you this morning in your home to this dramatic scene in Mark's gospel, in Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. As together this morning we look at this earliest account in the Gospels of the resurrection of Jesus. And we'll see the scene unfold in three movements. It starts with the expectation of death. Then there's shock. Resurrection is found. And lastly, the text is an open invitation for you and for me together this morning to believe in resurrection anew and to be an Easter people as we live in our times where death is so rampant, to point people to the hope, the forgiveness, the life that comes through him. Turn with me in your Bibles and once again to Mark chapter 16 as we see here in verses 1 through 3 the expectation of death. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they could go and anoint him. And very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb at sunrise. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us?" Stop there for a moment. These women, they find themselves with this concern of how will they roll away the stone. Well, who were these women? It says in the text, Mary Magdalene. We know from Luke chapter 8 that she had demons cast out of her. She, no doubt, had experienced in her life the power of Jesus to heal. As well, Mary, another one is mentioned, the mother of James, perhaps James the Less or James the Younger, the son of Alphaeus, one of the 12 disciples. And then Salome, Hebrew for shalom, and peace in its rendering. Perhaps some believe she was the wife of Zebedee, who was the father of James and John, those sons of thunder. These women are these first eyewitnesses that morning that something happened. And notice the text tells us that they are expecting to see death. Now the scriptures are clear that these women were eyewitnesses of the things that had just occurred. They had seen what had happened to Jesus. They weren't delusional by any means. Look before in Mark chapter 15, verse 40, it says, "There were also women watching from a distance. Among them Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger of Joseph, and Salome." These women were at the cross when they saw Jesus die. They know what they saw with their eyes. In verse 45 as well, it reminds us that they as well were a part of what happened at the tomb. He gave the corpse to Joseph in verse 46. And after he brought some linen cloth, Joseph took him down and wrapped him in linen. And he laid him in a tomb cut out of the rock, and he rolled a stone against the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, was watching where he was laid. Mark is very clear. These women saw Jesus die on that cross. These women saw Jesus placed in Joseph's tomb. These eyewitnesses came that Easter morning expecting to see what they had just saw 3 days earlier. Jesus' body wrapped, dead in a tomb. Now, the scriptures make clear for us that what is seemingly harder to explain makes even more sense. And the fact that these women are used as witnesses and the fact that they were the ones who had seen these things on the cross and at the tomb make it simple for us to see that the difficulty of resurrection would be met by the eyes of these first skeptics that saw it. I mean, could it be true? Could it be true? We saw what happened. But what was their task? The scriptures tell us that they came very early in the morning and they came to anoint Jesus. They were appearing and preparing themselves to mitigate the effects of death. They were coming to attend to the deceased body of Jesus. They were coming to make it smell less. That's what would often happen in the first century. People would be buried in a tomb, oftentimes a family tomb. And after time, they would allow over the course of a year or so for their body to decompose just down to the bones. And these women, in these first few days after Jesus' death, are coming to anoint his body with smells so that the stench of death would not overcome those who walked by that tomb. People throughout the year then would go to that place, and perhaps others in a family would be placed there and then placed in an ossuary, a bone box, and oftentimes whole families would have places together where they were buried. And their greatest obstacle that morning to mitigate the smells of death was the fact that there was a big stone. What will move, or who will move the stone? They expect to find Jesus dead. Death is so final like that, isn't it? Death is so heavy. Death demonstrates the finality and the power at work. And that stone was a symbol of how hard it would be to bring back life from the dead. Death always seems to win in the end. I remember the first time I was really confronted with the finality of death in a moment right before my eyes. as you know, we are Staten Islanders, and I like to say that we are born and raised on the exotic Isle of Staten together. It's a beautiful place. And for those of you that are from here, you know that many of us, thousands of us, every day get to commute on this beautiful orange cruise ship that we take into Manhattan for work or pleasure. And I remember one day when I was heading into the city. It was a beautiful day. And I remember sitting on the top of the ferry where I usually like to sit outside. And like every New Yorker, I'm consumed with what I'm reading and to myself. And then all of a sudden, the huge ferry ship starts to hit the brakes and stop in the middle of the water. Now, I was up on the front, out towards the top, and I started to hear from the back of the boat screams as people looked over the edge. And all of a sudden, as I got up and looked over to see what everybody else was looking at, I realized what it was. A woman had jumped into the water to take her own life. And I remember as I was there on the edge, seeing her lifeless body floating there with her exposed back, with people screaming. I remember screaming myself, "Somebody help her! Somebody help her!" And I felt overwhelmed with anguish and sadness and fear. And I remember falling back on the bench and just sitting there, taking in the sight of what I had just saw and thinking, "God, help her." And I screamed out to God, "God, help her. God, help her." And then a rescue boat pulled up alongside her, pulled her body inside, lifeless, and took her off. And the engines started back up, and we started heading back towards the city. And I remember crying in anguish, thinking, God, it's over for her, her family. What in her own life took her to the point to make a decision like that? Death does not give up its victims. And that's what those three women were expecting on Easter Sunday, thousands of years ago. To recognize that death and the grave does not give back what it takes for itself. But this is where we see this surprise in the middle of this scene. In verses 4 through 6, we see this shocking revelation that the women do not find death. Rather, that morning they found resurrection. Look what it says in verse 4 of Mark chapter 16. Looking up, they noticed that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And when they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he told them. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they put him." Amazing. Who is this young man? It's strange, but once again, this is not how you build a conspiracy. But the harder to explain makes it even more authentic. This man that in other Gospels is explained as an angel, we see communicating to these women the truth of Easter morning, the same truth that we are celebrating in 2020, that he is not here, for he is risen. It's an amazing statement. Perhaps no greater sentence has ever been uttered in human history. And Jesus has been saying this for a while to his disciples. He has been giving echoes of resurrection for them, if they will have ears to hear it. At least 3 other times in Mark's gospel, Jesus foretells of his own death and resurrection. And each time Jesus does, the disciples are puzzled. They don't understand. Peter, remember at chapter 8, verse 39, the end of that first major movement in Mark's gospel where he declares that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's not too later after that when they are finding themselves coming down after the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus tells them about resurrection in chapter 9, verses 9 through 10. And he says, don't say anything until I rise from the dead. Privately as well with his disciples later on in Mark 9, verse 31, after he has cast out this unclean spirit out of the boy, Jesus hints towards resurrection again. And the text tells us the disciples are puzzled and they don't understand. And a third time, in chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, after the encounter with the rich young ruler, verse 35 tells us that Jesus hints towards echoes of resurrection and they are puzzled. In fact, right afterwards, we see that this is the scene where James and John are concerned with who will get to sit with Jesus near him on his great throne. We see these disciples, like you and I oftentimes, not able to even process beyond our own self-interests in the face of things around us. You know, if the disciples had ears to hear early on and eyes to see, they would have been expecting resurrection that morning. And my question for you and for me this morning is, do you and I have eyes of faith like that? Do we anticipate and believe and long for resurrection? Do we look for echoes of it and hints of it in our life as we experience God bringing newness out of that which is old and dead? Some of the greatest themes in all of art and in movie and in literature are themes of resurrection. Every good story is a story of rebirth, of renewal, of a change from what someone was to who they are and what they can become. Watch your favorite films and notice how the hope of something being changed, of a person's attitude, of a situation that you and I long for and think about and pray for resurrection. But you know, around us as well in our world, we see the greatest evidences of the echoes of resurrection in the life of what God does in you and in I when we submit ourselves to Him. And when God brings life out of the dead bones that we often are living in. Recently talking to someone who shared their testimony with me. For years, they lived in rebellion against God. For years, they lived just medicating themselves with the things of this world, with the lust of the flesh, with whatever drugs and drinking and whatever other earthly pursuits they could do just to fill the hole that they found within them. And they said it's as if they were living life and they felt dead. And it wasn't until a moment when God literally had them on the ground where they were able to look up and recognize the echo of resurrection, the hope that Jesus offered them, the new life that was a promise to them. And they said it was in that moment of greatest darkness and despair when they recognized who Christ was for the first time. You and I, we long for resurrection. We long to see it happen in our life and in our world. We long to see it right now as we live in our society, trying to be different as the people, as the church of God. And I believe that as the people of God during this season and time that we find ourselves, we have the opportunity to be resurrection people like never before. We have the opportunity to point people to the hope that's found in Jesus. Because the words of that man at the tomb to those three women still echoes true for you and for me. He is not here. He is risen. No matter what darkness, no matter what sin, no matter what despair, no matter what sadness, no matter what hopelessness you may be going through right now, to know Jesus means that you proclaim in your life, in your testimony, that God is alive, that God is at work, and that you could trust him. You and I, every day, get to find the resurrection hope around us and share it with those who need it. You can find it. So this morning, we see how this text starts with expecting death, but how resurrection interjects itself and reminds us that life is at work, that we do not need to be a people of despair. And this leads us in the last few verses here in Mark with an opportunity to respond this morning. Will you and I take the opportunity to believe and share the hope of resurrection? Will these three women? Look what it says in verses 7 and 8 as they respond with faith, this great opportunity of faith for them. It says they went out, verse 7, but go tell his disciples, the man says, and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and you will see him there just as he told you. And they went out and they ran from the tomb, became trembling and astonished and overwhelmed them. And they said nothing to anyone since they were afraid. Interesting. Couple observations here. First, these women are alarmed. They're surprised. They're shocked by resurrection. They get seized by the fear of the moment, and their first response is silence. This man tells them, go tell Peter. Get the word out. Christ is not dead. He is risen indeed. And the text says that they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid. You know, it's interesting. In Mark's gospel, there's this theme called the messianic secret. That throughout Mark's gospel, time and time again, Jesus refers to his disciples and others to tell them to hold these truths about who I am quiet. In fact, back in chapter 8, at the end of that chapter, Peter, after he confesses who Jesus is, Jesus says, let's keep it quiet. It's a theme throughout this text saying that the time had not yet come for the hope and reality of resurrection to be shared completely. And now, in this ironic twist, when this man has just said, Jesus is not here, he has risen, and the women are given an opportunity to proclaim it anywhere and everywhere, their response is silence. The presence of fear in the text. It says they were trembling and overwhelmed. For these women, for you and for I this morning, the presence of fear is often an opportunity for great faith. It's often an opportunity for you and I to point people to the hope that's found in Christ. Are you afraid this morning? Do you feel overwhelmed with the things that are going on around you? You're at the perfect place to point people to the hope of resurrection. You're at the perfect moment to share with others around you that fear does not need to dominate my thought and my mind. That in this moment I can believe, like Jesus said to Jairus, do not be afraid, only believe. The presence of fear is an opportunity for faith. But secondly, an observation here, the text then just ends. The book of Mark ends at verse 8 very abruptly with this scene, and they said nothing to anyone since they were afraid. Now, you know, in your Bibles, there's another section that's added on towards the end, but our earliest and our best manuscripts, they are not found in there. And so the options are, how did this happen? Did perhaps Mark never write an ending and maybe he died before he penned the final words? Or perhaps was the ending maliciously taken out? Or maybe was it lost and cut off and later generations would add what's called the longer ending of Mark, which is not most original, in order to try to cap off this story. Whatever the true answer is, it's one that is lost mostly to history, even though we have some good assumptions of what it might be. But the text ending in verse 8 in our scriptures that we have for us today at least tells us this: that fear and silence about the resurrection would not be the final word. We know that these women went on to tell others. We know that there were other witnesses, as 1 Corinthians 15 reminds us. We know that the disciples found out and heard. That this ending in a very dramatic way, in a very literary way, is an invitation for you and for I to ask, will we be overcome with fear? Or will we share the message of Easter, that He is risen? He is risen indeed. The author turns to you and to me. Jesus turns to you and to me this morning and says, finish the story. Be a part of this narrative of Easter morning. Share resurrection. Share the hope of life that comes through Christ. The silence is our invitation to respond. Write your name into that story this morning. Your personal losses, your pain, your fears, your anxieties right now may seem so final, but we this morning could hope anew in resurrection hope. That God works newness in life, and those places of fear and despair are the exact moments where God wants to share His hope to a lost and dying world. And most importantly this morning, we can proclaim that second death, that sin and the devil have been dealt with. It's through simple faith in what Jesus accomplished that morning. It's this idea from the gospel in Isaiah 53 verse 5 that tells us He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon Him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with His wounds we are healed. Do you believe that message? Do you share it? Romans 6:23 reminds us that the wages of sin is death, that second death. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Easter reminds us that Jesus did more than conquer physical death that morning. He conquered spiritual death and separation from Him forever. And the invitation open for you and I this morning is, will I respond? Will I trust? Will I believe what Christ has done for me and find forgiveness? I encourage you this Easter morning, wherever you are seated around the world, as you hear this gospel truth, this resurrection reality, believe that the one who has conquered sin and death offers you forgiveness. Will you trust Him? Will you believe in Him this morning? The wonderful good news of the gospel is that in Jesus Christ, you are fully known and fully loved. That He is your substitute. And the resurrection is the first fruits for you and for I of a hope for life eternal. Only God could rewrite the news of the day like this. We need to let Him do His work. Allow Him to change us from the inside out. Eustace Clarence Scrubb, he's a character in the C.S. Lewis trilogy or series, The Chronicles of Narnia. He's the cousin to Edmund and Lucy, and he's arrogant and whiny, if you remember him. He's selfish and self-centered, old Eustace Clarence Scrubb. He's a rotten boy. And the book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he is brought to Narnia. And in this book, much of the story traces his own personal journey and transformation from death into life. And when he finds himself here at Narnia, old Eustace goes wandering around. And Eustace finds himself amidst a dragon's treasure. And as he is weeding through the vast gold and jewels and jewelry, Eustace starts to be overcome. He starts to dream of the comfort, of the wealth, of the power, of the self-centeredness that his life could be characterized by now that he has all these possessions to himself. And the book tells us, and perhaps you've seen it in the movies or the TV show, that he places on his arm this golden bracelet, Lord Octavian's arm bracelet, and he falls asleep with his happy dreams of fulfilling all that his greedy heart could desire. But if you remember the story, Eustace wakes up the next morning and he has a great pain in his arm around this bracelet because he wakes up and he is not a boy anymore. He wakes up and he's a dragon. He wakes up and he realizes his body is full of scales. And the physical pain of this small bracelet on his dragon arm is agonizing and it's excruciating. And this greed on the outward transformed him from the inside out. And now this once young boy finds himself a brooding dragon. Now the book unfolds and shows how even in this state he is used in many ways. But towards the end, Aslan takes young Eustace, this dragon, to a top of a mountain. And at this mountain, there's a beautiful garden and a well inside of it. And Eustace starts peeling at his scaly, slimy, serpent-like skin, layer after layer after layer. He wants it off of him. He recognizes where his greed had led him. But the more and more he tries in his own power to scrape it off, he realizes his efforts are in vain. And then Aslan, the lion, if you remember, looks at Eustace and he says, "You will have to let me undress you." And then Eustace says the following: "The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I have ever felt. And the only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. He peeled the beastly stuff right off of me. And just as I thought I had done myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt. And there it was lying in the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and knobbly, looking worse than it had ever been. And there was I," Eustace says, "smooth and soft as a peeled switch and smaller than I had been. And then Aslan took hold of me. I didn't like that much. I was very tender underneath now that I had no skin. But he threw me into the water, and it smarted like anything, but only for a moment. And after that, I became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arms. And then I saw why I had turned into a boy again." And he says, "After the bit, the lion took me out, and he dressed me, and he put on me new clothes." Resurrection for young Eustace. The attempts to peel off those dragon layers in his own effort left him still a dragon. But the work of Aslan, this Christ-like figure in the Chronicles of Narnia, was to change Eustace. Not just peeling away those outer layers, but changing him from the inside out and dressing him with new clothes. And this is what Easter morning reminds us of, that God in Jesus Christ went to death on our place so that he could be resurrected to new life for us. And he offers for you and me this morning new clothes, resurrection clothes, if you will, a new life that we could have through faith and trust in him. And this morning, we could be shocked and refreshed anew by the power of resurrection on Easter Sunday. No matter what death and sadness you may be in the midst of, to know Christ by faith means you can be forgiven, and you could be changed, and you could put on new resurrection clothes as we stand in our world offering to people the hope that only comes in him. Trust him this morning to peel back those dragon layers in our life, to die and to be reborn like he was. Because death may be in the news all the time, but in the end, resurrection always wins.